Economic Impacts in Iran as a Result of the United Nations Sanctions by Austin Culbertson. Here's a little bit about the event. The event that I will be talking about is the economic impact that the recent United Nations sanctions had on the country of Iran. These sanctions came about recently in late September and came as a result of Iran's recent activities and threats. The details of the sanctions include a reinstated arms embargo to Iran, bans of uranium usage and development, nuclear missile activity, and transferring technology. The sanctions are because of Iran's recent nuclear actions and threats, which violated a 2015 nuclear deal among the UN. These sanctions limit their position in foreign trade and investment, limit purchasing power, create higher costs and less currency value of the Iranian rial. Iran, as a country, focuses much of their economy towards their nuclear position and technology. Here's why I chose it. I am learning more about my personal economic and financial situation, which makes me wonder about the people in Iran who live there and are affected by these sanctions and what their financial situations are as a result. The nuclear conflict that happened recently between the US and Iran was always on my TV or social media. War is what I think of when I think of Iran. Choosing this topic allowed me to learn about their country from an economic standpoint. Lastly, we are part of the UN, so it's an issue we should care about. Here's how it relates to our Travels of a T-shirt book. In Travels of a T-shirt, Rivoli talked about how the human cost of global economics, which ties a connection to the people in Iran, ordinary people in Africa, and Travels of a T-shirt were affected by the T-shirt's journey, and ordinary Iranian people were impacted by the sanctions from an economic standpoint. As stated in the text, in 2007, used clothing was America's third largest export to Tanzania, and exports have increased by nearly 50% from 2006. Tanzania was one of the largest customers for American used clothing, with competitions from countries such as Angola, Mozambique, and Benin. This shows how in Africa, ordinary African traders and consumers rely on the used clothing market, and how the U.S. and other big Western countries' trade personally impacts them. In Iran, ordinary people are affected by these UN sanctions on their economy because they are having a worse inflation rate, not as many medicine imports, and people are being hurt by these things. As stated in an article from the New York Times, they were already struggling with more than 40% inflation, rising unemployment, uncertainty about the direction of the country. Many fear a war will return with Israel and the United States. This shows that ordinary people in Iran are not getting jobs, struggle with high expenses from inflation, and fear that war could ruin their country. They are impacted because they have nowhere to go and cannot choose that these things are happening. In our Travels of a T-shirt book, the African traders of used clothing must depend on the bigger countries for a supply of clothing to make a living. These people are just ordinary and are trying to live their lives, but have to depend on other countries like Iran. Iranian civilians are reliant on their government for their economic situation. Impact on raw supplies, labor, manufacturing, distribution, sales, and resales. Raw supplies. The sanctions targeted the importing and exporting of important raw supplies to Iran, like oil and gas. As stated in the article, the new sanctions freeze assets and ban travel for a range of Iranian entities and individuals, and authorize countries to stop and inspect cargo traveling from Iran by air and sea on Iranian government vessels, including oil tankers. Labor. Workers in Iran face unemployment and inflation due to factories and other industries being shut down. As stated in the article, the greatest pressure will be on the small and medium-sized enterprises, he said, which account for over 90% of Iran's industrial units and about half of the industrial employment. Manufacturing. The United Nations sanctions blocked Iran from importing machinery, industrial parts, and other parts they needed, which slowed down the overall speed of their industries. Continued. Distribution. The UN sanctions created shipping restrictions that limited trade options for Iran. As stated in an article, the so-called snapback sanctions process is set to begin Thursday, which would once again freeze Iran's assets abroad, halt arms deals, and penalize any development of its ballistic missile program, with further sanctions set to squeeze the country's already ailing economy. Sales resales. Businesses lost foreign buyers and access to suppliers. Oil and other manufacturing goods plummeted because they could no longer export. Summary of Iranian brace for economic impact of new UN sanctions. Iranians expect things to get worse in their country from an economic standpoint. As stated in the article, Iran's economic situation, already dire with water and power shortages, staggering budget deficits, and a devalued currency, is now expected to deteriorate even further. Things were already bad in Iran for their economy, and the new UN sanctions are making things worse. The currency for Iran, called the rial, has already dropped 4%. Iran is cut off from foreign banking, trade, exports, and had their assets frozen. The article talked about how the US and European countries have a strong say in the sanctions and want to make Iran and their economy suffer as a result. They've created a political stronghold over Iran because of their nuclear violation, and the people pay the biggest price. This was a valid source and used a lot of analytics and deepest research. Western resources were used. European nations to use snapback sanctions to isolate Iran over nuclear program. France, Germany, and the UK decided to use snapback sanctions from a 2015 Iranian nuclear deal that was violated by Iran. With the help of the UN, they decided to reimpose these sanctions against Iran. This came about because of the recent Israel and US conflicts. The sanctions are supposed to freeze Iranian assets abroad, halt arms transactions, and restrict ballistic missile development and nuclear activity. Iran believes that this is unfair and thinks they are being targeted. As stated in the article, Iran's foreign minister slammed the move to reinstate sanctions as unjustified, illegal, and lacking a legal basis. Iran already has a declining economy, and they want to end all communication with the IAEA, and their currency value is declining, and oil exports is reducing. This was a valid source, mostly gave pro-sanction perspective, good overall information. UN sanctions against Iran to resume over banned nuclear activity. The UN planned to resume sanctions imposed on Iran because of a violation within their nuclear program that violated the 2015 sanctions. First started with the European countries of France, Germany, and the UK, then the whole UN. Because of being allies, China and Russia didn't agree with these sanctions. They are attempting to block them. As stated in the article, a last-minute resolution to delay the move by 6 months, led by China and Russia, only received 4 votes. Iran says these sanctions are illegal and that they're just politically motivated. They have had assets frozen, trade communications, and exports cut, creating a decline in their economy. This was a valid source, the most neutral source, and it gave both perspectives. Here's why it's important and what we can learn. I would say the declining of Iran's economy because of the recent UN sanctions is important for many reasons. It shows how political agendas and actions can affect ordinary people and create unwanted consequences as a result. We can see the impacts of people losing their jobs, declining exports, high inflation rates, and weak economies can hurt the people in an irreplaceable way. We learned how being interconnected within other global markets can go away very quickly to sanctions and have a ripple effect. We can also learn that the role that politics plays into the economy. Here's what I learned about how to evaluate information. I learned that different articles and news sources have the same general information, but tend to display it in a different tone. I learned how to differentiate if an article is accurate and uses evidence to back their claims. I learned how to acknowledge if an author is using logical fallacies in these articles. This means they are using reasons for their arguments that are persuasive but are inaccurate because they're not using true logic or are creating points that are not relevant to the topic or using emotional words to make you believe something based on their tone. Lastly, I learned that it's important to use recency in articles to see what the most current information is. Conclusion. The economic impacts on Iran because of the recent UN sanctions were detrimental to Iran. It impacted many different economic areas for Iran. This included limited trade, limited exports, high inflation rates, unemployment, currency devaluing, and hurting their manufacturing. This event relates to Travels of a T-shirt because it shows the connection of how ordinary people are impacted by economic decisions and the connection between politics and economics and how political motives are always above economic motives. This was an important event because it allowed us to see how people in the world are impacted firsthand from an economic disaster because of political things they cannot control. Here are my references. Thank you.